Welcome back, folks. These are our recorded lectures for HI 237, and today it is English Cataclysm, Puppet Kings, Protection Rackets, and the Danelaw. So what we're going to be looking at today is basically a new phase of raiding. Mid-9th century rather, marked the start of an escalation in Viking activity. Not surprisingly, this is the same pattern we'll see in Ireland. Specifically, once they started to have bases in the islands, inland raiding becomes much easier. Now, we can also assume that the escalation in Viking activity had something to do with greater coordination of forces between leaders operating on both sides of the English Channel. It definitely does not have to be all new activity coming from Scandinavia. Now, this is the background, of course, for the arrival of the Great Army in 865, at which point the picture changes again. So, the Great Army appears in East Anglia in 865. It actually seems to be a coalition army, and it seems to have had several leaders. We know very little about its internal structure or how it was organized, beyond the obvious fact that it was a very significant escalation. It would have been easier to understand if it had been under a single king, but it wasn't. The army spent its first winter in East Anglia and took Danegeld, or tribute, from the East Anglians in the form of cavalry mounts. Now, this was a common strategy on the continent, as we'll discuss later. This was constantly done with the Franks. The Scandinavians would get them to buy peace with the Danegeld, which was sometimes massive. And technically, if peace was bought with the Danegeld, you're not supposed to turn around and then raid the people who just paid you. But they did, sometimes immediately. It's a bit questionable, yeah. In many cases, you couldn't not pay. You had to solve the problem somehow. Now, the key thing to remember about the Great Army is that it's not a raiding force. It's a full-scale invasion army. It's not a sudden change in tactics, however. As the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us, it was a steady escalation from the 830s onwards. So in that first year, they moved north from East Anglia to Northumbria, using the Roman roads, which were very vital to the Scandinavian invasion. They used them to head north to the River Humber, and then met their longships, which ferried them to the other side of the river and allowed them to advance directly on York. Now, York fell very easily, and we can attribute this to the chaotic mess that was masquerading as Northumbrian politics at the time. Now, in the 8th century, you saw king after king after king in Northumbria, most of them with no real claim to royal lineage and no real stability in their rule. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle actually says, quote, "The Northumbrians were seriously at odds with each other." Now, big question, is this the reason the Scandinavian army does head north to Northumbria? Because it was an easier target? Now, York, which was the capital, was used as the Vikings' inland base for the raiding north of the Humber. All right, so various sources provide appropriately lurid descriptions of everything that the army did to the churches, the monasteries, and the people of Northumbria. Some of the major Northumbrian monasteries were destroyed in this period. Possibly the most important example is Whitby in 866. Now, this is actually where it took on the name Whitby, or Whitby, which is Old Norse for White Bay. It had a different name under the Anglo-Saxons. This had been the site of the Great Summit, where the English kings decided to support Roman rather than Celtic Christianity in the previous century. Now, the Vikings did provide the Northumbrian kings with an excuse to unite and try to kick them out of York, which they did in 866, or they tried to do, rather. From what we can tell from different descriptions of the battle, the Vikings suckered them, basically. They feigned defeat, and they allowed the Northumbrians to enter York, at which point they were slaughtered by the Viking forces still in the city. Now, we can consider this decisive defeat the beginning of Viking York, or Jorvik, which is a term used for the city itself, but also for the Anglo-Scandinavian kingdom, whose capital it was. And this gives the Vikings a very strong foothold in the north. Now, the two Northumbrian kings who were defeated were kind of written off by the English chroniclers as bad men who'd met with divine retribution for having swiped church lands. Although, to be fair, they probably needed to take church lands in order to conscript soldiers, something they weren't able to do from lands that were in ecclesiastical possession. Now, one of the kings who was killed, Aella, was supposedly killed via the Blood Eagle ritual, according to both English and Scandinavian sources. And I apologize for this. It supposedly involved breaking the ribs and pulling out the lungs, sort of using them like eagle's wings. Is it real? We don't know. Lots of debate over this. It's a little bit too over the top to ring true, really. It sounds more like something that Christian writers would say the evil pagan Scandinavians did to good Christian kings. I'd like to think it's not real, but, there are worse things in history, too. Now, with Jorvik as a base, the Vikings were able to turn their attention south in the next year, and specifically to Mercia. Now, Mercia is one of the major English kingdoms. It's a confederacy of sorts, possibly made up of many smaller political units. We don't understand its history fully because there's a lack of sources. They were no longer top dog on the English ladder. They had been for quite some time. They were still rich, just not as powerful, so they were an obvious target. Now, our sources record the Mercian king Burgred asking Wessex for help, suggesting that he came under immediate pressure. And he did get the help he wanted from the king of Wessex, who was Aethelred, and his brother, Alfred, who is obviously slightly more famous than his older brother. It is somewhat ineffective. The forces from Wessex besieged the Vikings in Nottingham, and after a negotiated settlement, they returned to Northumbria. This didn't buy Mercia very much time. In 869, the army went back into East Anglia and Mercia, and was much more successful. Now, there are a few incidents that are worth noting. They destroyed the monastery at Meadshemstead. Okay, I'm going to mispronounce that. Meadshemstead. Now, this was a monastery that had been founded by Pieta, who was the first Christian king of Mercia. Our chronicles really do take notice of such instances. In a way, the Vikings are destroying the sacred geography of the English kingdoms every time they do something like this. In East Anglia, they killed Edmund the king, and you are actually going to be reading, or possibly have already read, an excerpt from the Martyrdom of St. Edmund. It was translated from the original by Abbo of Fleury, by Elfric, who was an Anglo-Saxon scholar. Even Abbo's account was apparently third-hand. He heard it from Dunstan, who heard it from King Athelstan, who heard it from Edmund Swordbearer. And of course it gets dressed up with a lot of the historiographical flourishes that you would expect from a saint's life. Now, as a piece of propaganda, which is designed for an English audience under threat by the Northmen, it's very interesting, and we'll talk about it at our Zoom session. It is a little wild, just to warn you, but it's actually a fairly enjoyable document to read. I'll be interested to hear your take on it. All right, so the important thing to remember is that the whole Great Army is not moving together all the time. Halfdan, for example, led a portion of the host into Wessex while Ivar headed north, and Halfdan engaged Aethelred and Alfred at the Battle of Ashdown in 870, or perhaps early 871. So I'm going to give you a quote from Asser's Life of Alfred, which was basically a contemporary biography written by someone who did know Alfred quite well. This is about the battle. The Vikings, splitting up into two divisions, organized shield walls of equal size, for they then had two kings and a large number of earls, assigning the core of the army to the two kings and the rest to all the earls. When the Christians saw this, they too split up the army into two divisions in exactly the same way and established shield walls no less keenly. But as I have heard from truthful authorities who saw it, Alfred and his men reached the battlefield sooner and in better order, for his brother, King Aethelred, was still in his tent at prayer, hearing Mass and declaring firmly that he would not leave that place alive before the priest had finished Mass, and that he would not forsake divine service for that of men, and he did what he said. I just love that bit. I'm sorry. So the army of Wessex was victorious, according to Asser, even if Big Brother left Little Brother holding the bag. The description of the battle is actually extremely detailed. Asser talks about tactics and the actual geography of the battlefield. You can tell he had testimony from people who were actually there. Now, although this victory was promising, Aethelred died at the end of April, and Alfred succeeded him on the throne, where he proceeded to lose his first 9 battles against the Danes, and he had to buy peace from them. Now, the only thing that really saves Wessex at this point is that the Great Army becomes somewhat distracted. And there are several elements in this distraction. First of all, Northumbria had risen up against the client king that they had been imposed upon them by the Vikings, and Halfdan had to fight to reclaim the north in 872. Mercia was also a problem. They had essentially conquered it in 873 by driving King Burgred to flee. They named a thane in his place who was willing to give them hostages and swore loyalty to them. This is Ceolwulf. Think about it for a moment. The concept of a puppet king. It's the Danelaw that really makes what they're doing worth it, not random plunder. The tribute that's given by kingdoms that have either been conquered or that have been terrorized into making an agreement. You don't want to plunge a kingdom into chaos. That cuts off the supply of Danelaw, of tribute. And ruling it yourself can be a pain, especially if you don't have a strong power base or easy access to reinforcements. I mean, Mercia is smack dab in the middle of the island. It's not Northumbria, so a local sub-king is a great idea. Now, at this point, we move into a period that's difficult to see clearly, simply because it has been so mythologized. These are the years when Alfred the Great supposedly saved England. We have to take that with a grain of salt. I mean, no one is denying that these were a dramatic set of events, but, they don't have perhaps the overwhelming significance that you would think. So in 874, the Great Army appears to have been divided. Possibly this is a case of diminishing returns. Some elements of the army may simply have gotten tired of raiding and decided to settle down. Other parts stayed active under Halfdan. Some of the warbands focused on Northumbria. They did things like cause the final evacuation of Lindisfarne. But Halfdan was primarily concerned with attacking the kingdom of Dublin. He does make himself king of Northumbria in 876. He's probably tired of having to deal with puppet kings at this point. Other elements of the Great Army continued operations in the south. They focused first on poor East Anglia, then on Wessex, where King Alfred wound up buying peace again in 875. In the following year, Alfred finally has a little bit more luck. We think he took advantage of the weather. Part of the Danish fleet had been destroyed at sea, and it left their land forces cut off. So he manages to blockade them in their fortress at Exeter, and although he couldn't take it, they reached an agreement that they would return to Mercia. So they did so and partitioned it and gave themselves territory in the eastern part of the kingdom. And unfortunately, this seems to have given them certain renewed ideas in relation to Wessex. So what happens? And this is where we're moving into the myth of Alfred. His court at Chippenham is attacked in 878, and he flees into the marshes. Now, there is a famous story related to this event. It's the story of Alfred and the cakes, and this is a story that I gather anyone from previous generations of people from England grew up hearing it in school. They don't hear it quite so much anymore, but, this is something that's, someone my age who grew up in England would know immediately. So supposedly Alfred goes into hiding in the marshes, and he stays with a simple housewife who is not aware of his identity. She just gives him shelter. And one day she goes out to accomplish something outside the house and says, "You need to watch my cakes for me so they don't burn." And as the story goes, he sat down to watch the cakes, but he became so distracted brooding over the bad situation that he was in that he did let the cakes burn. So, there's a bit of a moral lesson in that, obviously. It has a lot of cultural significance as well. It's supposed to be like a humanizing touch for this mythic leader. Now, we know that he manages to hold out in the marshes for the winter, and he rallied the Shire levies, the local militias, when the weather changed. He was finally able to engage the Vikings at Edington. He defeats them, and they come to an agreement. Their leader, Guthrum, would accept baptism. Alfred would become his godfather. Right. I know probably a lot of you have godparents, and in the 21st century, it doesn't really mean a lot. It's kind of like, okay, yeah, these are good friends of your parents. They might help look after you if anything happens to your parents. In the Middle Ages, to be a godparent is actually to literally, it's considered to be blood kin. You have effectively adopted the person that you're serving as godparent to. So you can't, intermarry with their family or anything like that. So Alfred basically adopts this Viking. This is something that Asser tells us, so it is probably true. Now, there is no such thing, however, as the Treaty of Wedmore. Whatever basic English history textbooks tell you, there is no record of an actual treaty there. There is a document from 886, so almost 10 years later, that gives us some sense of the relationship between the two. Boundaries are defined. How to handle disputes between Danes and Englishmen are laid out. It's not a treaty, and that's the important thing to remember. Now, the most important thing here is, of course, none of these agreements between Alfred and part of the Great Army dislodges the Danes from the lands they already occupied. Guthrum's army actually remained in Chippenham for a number of months before they left as agreed. Now, settlement is almost more important for the Danes than it was for the English, because it meant that they had been recognized and accepted within the wider community in England. Now, in the traditional historiography, the Battle of Edington and the so-called Treaty of Wedmore are generally seen as the point at which the tide turned for England, which is not really accurate. Alfred does not defeat the Vikings and save England. There is no real England at this point. England is a construction of Alfred's grandson, quite frankly. It is perhaps a point at which the English decided they had to concentrate on at least making some of these people neighbors, which would hopefully settle them down a little bit. All right, so the Danes settled in Mercia and East Anglia in what we historians eventually call the Danelaw. Oh, apologies for the broken animation there. I'm not going to start again, I'm afraid. Now, the boundary of the Danelaw runs right through Mercia, through Chester, along Watling Street into London. So, this is a significant chunk of the island. Now, Guthrum himself was strengthened as a leader by his baptism, and he saw new opportunities open up in the east. These are opportunities that are not going to be bothered, that Wessex, rather, is not going to bother stopping them from taking. He took on the English name Athelstan, and he shared out land in East Anglia to his Danes. So what we can look at these next few years is that this is sort of a working out period. They're all working out the consequences of their settlement. It seems to have been largely peaceful for most of those years. This is a political process rather than a military process. Now, Guthrum died in 890. In general, he had upheld the promises he had made to Alfred at his baptism. Alfred, a few years before that, had retaken London, mostly to crack down on piracy in the Thames estuary. He took control of the remaining territory of Mercia by marrying one of his daughters to the Ealdorman, who was sort of like a sub-king, Aethelred. And we're pretty sure that he's well aware at this point the Danish threat hadn't been conclusively ended, because we know he spent a lot of time preparing his kingdom for another Viking invasion. Now, why did he fear this? Probably because a large group of Northmen had left in 879 for the Frankish kingdoms. And the sort of back and forth movement across the English Channel is very common. I mean, when pickings were slim in the English kingdoms, they would go to Francia. When pickings were slim in the Frankish kingdoms, they would go back to England. Alfred's not an idiot. He's well aware of this. So 892, we see another major invasion. And there had been the occasional raid prior to that, including a number of naval battles. But 892 is the next serious outbreak of raiding. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says it was a fleet of 250 ships, probably an exaggeration, under a man called Haston. This may be actually Hasting from the continental sources, who was named as the leader of the Vikings on the Loire River in 866 and 874. Now, here's a funny thing. Trying to pick up on when different names in different sources actually refer to the same people is one of the tricks of studying the Vikings. You're never going to be perfect at it. The best you can do is try to make those connections. So they push into English territory through Western Mercia to Chester and all the way into North Wales. But the English were much better prepared this time. Alfred and Aethelred had organized their levies very well. In the interim, Alfred had fortified many of the larger settlements. These are called burhs. This is the word from which we get borough. So, Peterborough is, fortified, is a fortified town, basically, if you translate it. So what happens is that it prevents the Vikings from carrying out their usual techniques. They can't loot or occupy any of the major settlements. So this new host breaks up within a couple of years. Some of the war bands involved go off to settle in Northumbria and East Anglia. Others go back to the continent. And this is traditionally seen as the end of the first Viking period in England. The story of the next several decades, at least, is one of settlement and assimilation. So I want to talk just a little bit more, however, about the Danelaw. So there you have a map. You can see where it is, more specifically. This is one of the most challenging historical problems of the Viking Age in England, simply because we have no records as to how this settlement was organized. Good chance that it wasn't rigorously organized, or we'd know more than we do. As it is, it's hard to see exactly where the settlement even happened. Now, place name evidence is suggestive. Names ending with by or with Thorpe, or names that end with ton, which is English, but which have a Scandinavian first half slapped on them, that can show us where Scandinavian settlers had influence. But it's hard to be conclusive, and it's still a matter of a lot of debate. Now, linguists and philologists originally took these place names to meet mass immigration, but I don't know how to say this nicely. Linguists and philologists prior to the 1960s were pretty stupid in the way that they did this. They try to make sweeping conclusions about history using things like place names, and that's not a safe thing to do. They've mostly stopped doing that, so that's sort of a relic of the traditional narrative. Historians argue that it wasn't about floods of Danish peasants following their relatives into England in a mass colonization move. We can assume that some did arrive later, but it would make the most sense if the original settlement was organized by the military leaders of the Danes. It would also work with the evidence we have in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Land might have been seen as an extension of plunder, and thus it was, spoils to be handed out by the chieftain, or rather the king. We do know that the leaders of the Danelaw maintained a military lifestyle for at least a couple of generations. We have archaeological evidence of them establishing themselves in fortified centers on the major rivers. Certainly, there would have been later settlement due to cultural contact. So, relatives joining relatives, traders setting up shop in a new area that offers more opportunities. And safe to say there would also have been a lot of regional variation in the Danelaw. It's dangerous to make generalizations about motivations for settlement, especially given the lack of sources. So how Danish were they? So King Edgar, in the second half of the 10th century, issues a law code saying that, he recognizes it's necessary to legislate separately for the Danes and to respect their customs. This might have been partially shaped by his own need to maintain support in the north, The great Danish magnates had stood behind him. He had some difficulty taking the kingship. But also, it's just a practical thing. He's respecting the diversity of his kingdom and thus encouraging unity. I mean, multiculturalism is not a 20th century invention, people. Group identity in the early Middle Ages is a tremendously complicated thing. Multi-ethnic states, very, very common. Some historians actually make an argument that ethnic identity follows law rather than vice versa. I'm not sure how I feel about that. It's a sort of chicken and the egg kind of argument. As we're not on the ground in the 9th and 10th century, it's all speculative anyways. Now, we see more Danish law codes from other English kings in the 10th and 11th century. It might have been useful for these kings to recognize the Danish political constituency and make a show of respecting their privileges. Now, a note on the actual term Danelaw. It is not in use in the 9th century. It's actually a creation of the late 10th and early 11th. In other words, the treaty with Guthrum does not create the Danelaw. It isn't made, it grows. And the first time we actually see this is in the legal compilations from the reign of Aethelred II. Historians are using it more as a term of convenience at this point and debating constantly, as we do, on whether or not we should. Now, in the sources, the area is referred to by other names, the original kingdom names, for instance. Cultural assimilation is obviously an ongoing process. This can happen naturally with intermarriage. It can also happen deliberately, for instance, by pushing Christianization as a tool of unity. Now, obviously, this is what something like the agreement with Guthrum was at least in part about. Alfred tried it again with Haston, offered to be the godfather to his son. In general, we don't have much documentary information about how successful any of this was in the Danelaw itself. In the past, historians have argued that we have very few pagan graves from the 870s onward. And certainly we have relatively few graves that are maintaining their usual burial customs. But we have to remember that IDing pagan graves is problematic. If you're looking for a non-Christian grave, you look for graves with grave goods, since that wasn't a Christian practice. But the problem is you will find graves with grave goods, even in Christian contexts, like in churchyards, for example. Think about what this means for a minute. Graves could predate churchyards, or perhaps pagans didn't care about being buried in other people's holy grounds, or perhaps they defined their faith a little bit more fuzzily than we do, or perhaps grave goods are just clung to as a tradition with no real meaning in the afterlife. Probably we just need to concede that we can't draw sharp distinctions between the two faiths in this period. But it is safe to say that Christianization is a continuum, not an either-or situation. Now, what's ironic is that we actually see in the very late 9th century one of the Danish rulers in East Anglia producing coinage featuring St. Edmund. That is suggestive of Christianization, obviously. And certainly we see more Christian coins from the Danelaw start showing up in the 10th century. They're minted with crosses, inscriptions referring to St. Peter or St. Martin. This is obviously ecclesiastical influence. And it has been argued that perhaps the structure of the church in the Danelaw wasn't as disrupted as we thought it was, in which case the church would have gone to work Christianizing or civilizing the Danes. It's in their DNA in the medieval period. Now, we have to question, as a result, how much of a Scandinavian character is in fact kept. This is rapidly moving towards what we would call a hybrid culture. And once your interests start to coincide, cultural mixing and borrowing happens quite naturally. You have to think about class as well. It might have been useful for the elite to maintain a Danish identity for political or traditional purposes. But wouldn't your average Dane sitting down to farm not probably have more in common with English farmers? And then, of course, you get to intermarriage. Now, if you look at the two languages, Old English and Old Norse, they're not really that different in their basic structure. The Old Norse sources are from later than the English sources, but if you compare similar passages, you do see close connections. The big cultural impact of this is that, as a result, missionaries, traders, and soldiers would have had relatively little difficulty moving from England to Scandinavia if they wanted to do so. So we can assume that this probably fostered the growth of true cultural contact between the two homelands, not just in England. Now, the situation is entirely different in the rest of the British Isles, obviously. Celtic languages don't have these similarities to Old Norse. But by the 12th century, if you look at the use of English in the east and the north of the island, you can almost call it Anglo-Scandinavian. Look, for instance, at Bishop Wulfstan of York in the early 11th century. His vocabulary is highly influenced by Scandinavian words, but he's still speaking, or rather writing, Old English. Now, we have no Old Norse written sources from the period of settlement. We do have some runic inscriptions, and they survive on stone and sometimes on metal objects. And it shows us that Old Norse was spoken in England, even if it wasn't written. The local variation of Old Norse was highly conservative, although that's probably as much a function of the runic script as anything else. So some takeaways. Is the cataclysm in the title of this lecture warranted? Quite possibly, just from the level of disruption caused by the Great Army. That said, they are integrated rather well in the south, if very gradually. The north is a different matter, and one that we'll look at in other lectures. We really don't understand the process of integration very well. But again, that's not the focus of our sources, so should we be surprised? Archaeology is of great value in fleshing out this picture, but it cannot answer all the questions we have. And the last thing I would suggest you remember is that the valorization of Alfred tends to overshadow the complexity of the situation. You see the hero, you don't necessarily see everything going on in the background. Okay, I hope you all found that illuminating, and I will talk to you soon.